because it always says it.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Before we get started, oh, thank you. Looks like a lot of people have muted. If I can get everybody to mute their microphone and video during this, just so that we have plenty of bandwidth for this and we don't have things going on in the background. But I'm so excited to have Sam Glinsky with us tonight. He's a vegetation specialist with the maintenance division of TxDOT. He joined them in 2019, worked on a variety of projects so far, the state's Wildflower program, mowing program, herbicide program. He also oversees agencies. Hold on, I got people coming in. The agency's enrollment in the Monarch Candidate Conservation Agreement with assurances. So that he'll be telling us a little bit about the Monarch program that they're involved in. But he has a bachelor's degree in planning and management for agriculture and natural resources from University of Florida. And we are just so happy to have him with us tonight. Talking about some of the programs that TxDOT is involved in. So Sam, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and take over, I'll make sure everybody's muted for you.
Yeah, sure thing. First and foremost, I just wanted to say thank you all so much for having me. I'd say about 60% of my job is, public education, outreach, things like that. And I absolutely love it. Giving these presentations, whether it's Native Plant Society, Master Naturalist, Master Gardeners, educational institutions, or, local, state, or federal government, we do all that. And it's absolutely one of my favorite parts of my job. So thank you for having me. I will turn my camera off while I'm presenting just to save some bandwidth. If you can't tell, I am in a hotel room, so I don't have the best Wi-Fi right now. My job sees me traveling about 75% of the time. So if I don't have somewhere specific to be, I'm usually on the road. But anyways, I will try to share my screen here. We can get right into it. Alrighty. All right. I think y'all should be able to see that. Is that right?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Awesome. Alrighty. So I'm going to put it in presentation mode here. There we go. All right, so I titled this presentation TxDOT Supporting a Native Roadside because that's always our ultimate goal. First comes public safety, safety of the people who are traveling on our roadways. And then I don't need to tell you all about all the benefits of having a diverse native environment. So we'll get into a little bit of everything that we're doing today. If you have any questions, you can definitely put them in the chat. I would ask that we just stay muted till the end, just because it gets, especially with these online meetings, it can get a little bit much with people unmuting, background noise, things like that. But this won't be an extremely long presentation, and we will have absolutely, plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So as Debbie mentioned, my name is Sam Glinsky. I'm with the TxDOT's maintenance division. I work in the maintenance field support section of that division, but we are also known as vegetation management. Essentially anything vegetation related across the state comes through us. We give, advisory services out to the field, whether it's on a level of our districts or our specific offices or specific individuals. But yeah, roughly, anything vegetation related comes through us, unless it's landscaping related. That is a different section in a different division. But when we talk about TxDOT's programs, they all kind of revolve around this one quote: "Don't mow until the wildflowers have gone to seed." And then we say here that that was stated in the 1937 memorandum. The numbers are a little bit, well, at least personally, I'm not sure of exactly when these were stated. Things like our mowing program starting that early, I don't know the exact year. Some of that is either lost to history or at least, lost in my brain. But in the 1930s is when we really started working on a lot of these programs. So most of what we're talking about today aren't things that are extremely new. We've been doing them for a very long time. And of course, these programs are always evolving. So over the years, we've worked on enhancing the beautification of the right-of-ways. As you can see here, we have some very old pictures working on the roadsides, and we've continually preserved those right-of-ways by practicing proper mowing and herbicide applications. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, herbicide applications are a much more recent development, whereas mowing has been going on for much longer. But ever since the 30s there, we have delayed our mowing until the wildflowers have gone to seed. So mowing is a critical part of keeping the right-of-way beautiful and healthy. As many of you know, much of Texas traditionally, before humans was or is fire maintained. And while we don't use any controlled burning or anything like that on our right-of-ways, we do have things like mowing that can roughly take the place of those management that allows us to reset that natural ecological succession and not have the entire state as just a blanket of brushland or forest. So mowing is a very critical part of that. But we do wait to mow until our wildflowers have set seed. We always emphasize this in our trainings, whether it's contractors, district officials, or even just really anyone who works for the department. We kind of preach that. Now, of course, there are always some exceptions. Safety is number one with TxDOT. So if we get some areas where vegetation is growing too tall, we might need to mow a little bit early, do some spot mowing, things like that. Just for line of sight issues and safety on the roadway, but that's fairly atypical. And typically when we're talking about that stuff, we're not as much looking at our native vegetation because it really doesn't get that tall that early. We're talking about things like Johnson grass. I'm sure you're all probably somewhat familiar with Johnson grass, but that is our biggest threat to our healthy native right-of-ways across the state for sure. So we're always trying to work on the Johnson grass problem. I don't think, this problem can ever be eliminated across the state just because of the fact that in some senses it is desirable. For instance, the fact that it's palatable to cattle. Ranchers may not want to get rid of that Johnson grass because it's edible for their cattle. And I can't blame them, but on our right of ways, we don't want the Johnson grass, and we always do our best to control that. We keep our mowing height in our rural areas to a 7-inch minimum just to allow, shorter native vegetation, things like wildflowers, shorter native grasses to flourish. Setting this height relatively high just allows those native plants to come in, but really helps combat those things like, Johnson grass, as well as some of, the taller natives, things like switchgrass that can impede line of sight as well. And our 7-inch minimum doesn't harm our milkweed and other late blooming pollinator plants. We've actually found that milkweed responds very well to mowing. So yeah, we do our 7-inch minimum mowing, and we only mow about 2 times a year. Of course, this varies massively across the state because there are so many different, soil types, different environments, different types of management that are needed. But generally, we say we have 2 full mowing cycles per year, spring mow and a fall cleanup mow. We also have non-mow areas that are established for fall pollinator habitat and to reduce our maintenance costs. Mowing is very expensive, and that's no lie. I'd say 1 full mowing cycle across the state costs roughly $26 million. So it is not cheap. And having those non-mow areas is great because it helps reduce our cost, but also helps provide some great native habitat. Not that our mowed areas aren't, but those non-mow areas even more so help in the fall time, things like that. So since 1932, we've been using and seeding our wildflowers and native grasses across roughly 800,000 acres of roadside. Of course, back then there wasn't 800,000 acres, but that's about what we have now. We plant about 30,000 pounds of seed each year, which is approximately 15,000 acres of right-of-way. When we're doing strictly wildflower seeding, we use much higher rates, but for native grasses and revegetation planting, we're typically using, a lower pound per acre of each species. But those native grasses and wildflowers help provide food for pollinators, habitat for wildlife. They help with water conservation and, of course, erosion control, which is really critical when we talk about our infrastructure. We certainly don't want any erosion around our roadways, causing issues like frost heaving and failures in subbases. We could talk about that stuff all day, but erosion near the roadway is no good. So having a nice strong stand of native roots is very important. And we do consider these investments because protecting and preserving native grasses and flowers is a huge cost savings in the long run. There's many people that would argue that a full-on mowing program, mowing every month, things like that are cheaper, easier, more efficient. But in reality, these practices, if conducted properly, allow us to have these native right-of-ways that require much, much less maintenance. I mean, think about how often, if you have a manicured yard, how often you need to mow and manage that. You know, a very similar circumstance on our right-of-ways where we have that desirable native vegetation, we don't have to manage it as much overall. But our mowing practices do encourage and support that pollinator habitat by delaying our mowing to ensure that wildflower seed maturation. Also, our mowing is always done in cycles, whereas, you know, if I say we're doing our spring mow, we're not mowing every single county in the state on the same day. These things take quite a while. So when we've mowed in one area, you know, the county next door may have not been mowed, and it's sort of a, you know, rotational system, sort of working the same way that rotational grazing works in agriculture, sort of getting off into the ag side of things, but mowing in the same way really helps with that, you know, having that pollinator habitat available. So we say installation. I don't know that they're necessarily installed, but non-mow areas are great for that wildlife habitat, that pollinator habitat preservation. It's really hard to get a concrete number on how many acres of non-mow areas we have. I know that there's been some studies done in the past, and they they found that it was very hard to get concrete data on that because we don't have maps of our right-of-ways in that capacity. We have maps of all our roadways, but we don't have any like GIS maps or anything like that of every single segment of right-of-way that we own. So it's very hard to get that data, but by my estimation, we have at least 100,000 acres of non-mow area across the state. And what I consider non-mow is area that's going to be mowed either just once a year late in the fall as a cleanup or less. So it's between 100,000 and possibly even up to 400,000. Narrowing the field down any more than that would be very hard with the current data we have, but it should be somewhere in there. In every single district, we have 25 districts across the state. I myself am from a division, and we don't oversee the districts, but we provide advice to all the districts. So we don't, you know, with division, we don't have our own specific jurisdiction that we control, but our 25 districts each have their own operational structures and they control their jurisdictions. So each one of those districts has a vegetation manager who oversees the proper application of techniques of all these different vegetation management practices in each of those districts. But by establishing a sustainable vegetation management program that specifically addresses wildflower preservation and protection, as well as our native grasses, we've maintained a lot of biodiversity on a right-of-ways while reducing those mowing and maintenance costs overall. So education and outreach, you know, that's what I'm doing here today. And like I said, this is about 60% of my job. Whether it's internal or external, I'm on the road all the time traveling, educating people about our programs, how to properly conduct our programs, things like that. But to get into sort of the more technical examples, we have Monarch way stations. We have safety rest areas across the state, including 12 travel information centers, 80 safety rest areas, and those encompass 21 major highways. Of course, they're great for tourism, things like that, but also for the people of the state. And prior to talking about these safety rest areas and Monarch way stations specifically, TxDOT got involved with a program called the Monarch Highway. I believe this was in around 2015 and 2016. It was before my time at the organization, but I've done some research into the background. But the whole point of the Monarch Highway is all the states in the I-35 corridor agreed to this agreement where we're essentially just promoting public awareness of the monarch butterfly, honeybees, pollinators, and all that type of conservation across I-35. So as part of that, we organized educational materials and we protect and manage pollinator habitat, develop strategies for pollinator-friendly seed mixes. And that's a big one that we'll talk about in a little bit. But here we go. In 2015, we facilitated a cooperative agreement between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Native Plant Society of Texas. I'm assuming this was sort of like the statewide, I'm not sure exactly, but we allowed for those entities to plan, establish, and maintain monarch gardens at TxDOT safety rest areas, or monarch way stations, as we call them. They provide, of course, those nectar resources that are necessary for the monarch butterflies, as well as milkweed. But really, the main goal of these is public outreach. In comparison to all of our right-of-ways, these are only a very small area. Overall, the public outreach, you know, aspect of it is much bigger. But each of these has educational signage and opportunities for the traveling public to engage in that conservation. We also have videos that play on our different maintenance practices, as well as wildflowers, things like that, and they play at all of these safety rest areas. But these Monarch Way stations right now are installed at 4 of our SRAs, north and southbound in Hill County, north and southbound in Bell County. And we're planning to plant pollinator-friendly species at all 80 of our rest areas. I can't get too deep into the details there because our rest area planning, management, maintenance is a totally different group from myself, and I don't want to speak on their behalf. But we do have plans to plant that pollinator-friendly habitat at all of our rest areas. Seed packets, I would have brought these today if we were in person, maybe in the future though, but we do buy these seed packets each and every year. I'd say we probably buy about 10 to 15,000 of them, maybe even more than that at a time. And we hand them out at, talks we give across the state, things like that. And not only are these helping promote some small areas of pollinator habitat off of our right-of-ways, but again, the main point of that is, the public outreach and education. So you can see there, that's just what one of them looks like. And it shows our little pollinator mix on the back. Depending on the year and the availability, we also have milkweed in there. This last batch, we weren't able to get any, unfortunately, because it just wasn't the right conditions for milkweed growth that year. But yeah, that's what our pollinator seed packets look like. And we do a lot of additional seed purchasing as well for actual seeding on our right-of-ways on a much larger scale that we'll talk about just a little bit later. Here's just an example of the Hardeman County Safety Rest Area. This is the monarch fall migration, October 3rd, 2019. At this point, these monarchs were actually taking shelter from heavy winds on the backside of a tree. So that was just a little bit of an interesting picture to throw in there. So we're going to talk a little bit about where we're going in the future. So we've partnered with Texas A&M University, Kingsville, Tarleton State University, Texas AgriLife, Sul Ross, all these different universities and programs to develop regionally appropriate native plant seed sources for use by TxDOT and other entities. It's called the Texas Native Seeds Program. And TxDOT is not the only partner involved in that. There are many utility companies, range management, and a lot of large individual backers to that program as well. But working with them has resulted in 41 new native seed mix varieties with native grasses and pollinators that are now commercially available, but would not have been previously that we can use on TxDOT right-of-ways. And as a result of some of that research, seeding specifications have changed for over 2/3 of our 25 districts. A really fantastic program. Just a quick rundown of what they do. And again, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but essentially they're collecting certain species of interest from across the state, picking out the most prominent or suitable sort of genotype of that species for use on the right-of-way, getting plots of those established little grow outs, planting them. Then they get that seed and make that seed available to commercial suppliers. They don't do commercial supply themselves because it's a state university, but they make the seed available to commercial suppliers across the state. We've used this for a variety of things. I couldn't even start to list you all the grass species, but with some of our pollinator species, a big one that they've really just worked on recently is called clammy weed. And I believe it's the Zapata variety of clammy weed. Really great pollinator plant. They call it clammy weed because it smells like clams. But that's something that there's now quite a lot of commercial availability for, and we've been buying a lot of clammy weed seed in addition to all the other, pollinator-friendly seed mixes that we buy every single year. But we will continue to foster those collaborative partnerships with those entities focused on providing habitat for pollinators and just overall a good native environment along the roadsides. This is just an example of one of our seeding mixes. Now, when we typically talk about these, we're talking about revegetation. So at the conclusion of a maintenance project or construction project, what are we using to get that vegetation back? And as you can see here, we have a good variety of these native grasses. But the important part that I like to point out is that in our rural seed mixes like this, we have a lot of pollinator-friendly species as well. Purple prairie clover, Engelmann's daisy, Illinois bundleflower, Allenless bush sunflower, and that Allenless bush sunflower is another product of the Texas Native Seeds Program as well. You see some partridge pea on the right side over there. So pretty good variety of native grasses in there, as well as some pollinator-friendly species. Something else we do, this is part of why I travel so much. I train and my team, my group trains TxDOT licensed herbicide applicators. We have 1,300 licensed across the state for our pesticide recertification courses. All the pesticides we use are general use, so they're not required to be trained, but we do that for higher accountability and more education to those people to ensure that our programs are being enacted correctly. But we teach about things like vegetation and wildflower identification. That way we're not spraying our wildflowers, because of course we always want to perpetuate those. But we also teach proper herbicide timing and applications, and those are mandatory annual trainings. And then we also educate and support our districts, informational pamphlets, development and wildflower guides, the importance of pollinator plants, their placement, propagation, proper maintenance to support those. And we give seed mix recommendations all the time. I was actually just working on one of those cases this past Friday and this Monday. And we'll talk at the very end of the presentation a little bit about some of the education and outreach programs that we have going on just right now. So here's where we're going. I think Debbie mentioned this earlier, but we have the Monarch Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. This is sort of my main solo project that I've been working on since I have come to TxDOT. Getting TxDOT enrolled in this agreement, facilitating our enrollment, and making sure we're in compliance with the agreement. What this agreement does, it provides regulatory assurances to the participants and promotes conservation of the monarch butterfly through conservation measures and supplementary measures. I'm not going to get into the full breakdown of the differences there because it is a very complex agreement. The agreement itself is something like 100 pages long, and I've spent many hours reading it all over. And I could talk your ears off for 8 hours about that, but I'm not going to get too deep into it. Anyways, though, that's what they provide and sort of what we have to do to be in that program. But the program is a partnership between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and then the University of Illinois at Chicago Energy Resources Center sort of enacts the agreement on behalf of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and then all the certificate of inclusion holders. This is a nationwide agreement. I don't remember how many different states are currently enrolled, but it's both government agencies such as DOTs, as well as energy and transmission companies across the U.S. And this agreement has even has some reaches in Mexico, Canada, sort of across the whole North America. So it's a very big agreement. In fact, it's the largest CCAA, Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, ever enacted by far. And we have 100% of TxDOT's land enrolled in that agreement, which is roughly 1.238 million acres. This includes both our, grassy areas, our right-of-ways, our mowable areas, as we might call them, or our paved surfaces as well. This is every single acre that TxDOT owns. But we have 446,000 acres adopted, roughly. Those adopted acres are the acres where we pledge conservation measures in the Monarch CCAA. And realistically, this number would be much higher. But really the reason why we're at 446 is because it's very hard to, for example, if we included El Paso in our adopted acres, we might get one plot placed out there a year because we have to monitor these plots to prove that we have, these healthy native right-of-ways essentially. And that would be a lot of travel for one plot. So we've sort of restricted it to the main central flyway, as well as some of the coastal flyway, the areas that are most important. But just because you see 446,000 acres adopted, really these conservation measures are occurring across most of the state. And some of the conservation measures that we have are timed and limited mowing, targeted herbicide use, as well as non-mow areas. Pretty much everything else that we could talk about, wildflower seeding, controlling brush, those would all fall under the supplementary measures of the agreement. But these paved surfaces in non-habitat areas cannot be included because, of course, we're not planting things on the paved surfaces. We're not doing that conservation on the paved surfaces. We're doing it on the vegetated sides of the roadway. So in 2021, 108 out of 109 plots that we assessed passed the Monarch CCAA criteria. And those criteria are 10% ground cover of flowering, potentially nectar producing resources, specifically for the monarch butterfly, or 2 stems of milkweed. So we had 108 out of 109 plots pass. I'll take an over 99% pass rate any day. And pretty much all these pictures, most of these pictures anyways, in this whole presentation have been from our Monarch CCAA plots. So these are just some examples of what we have out in our right-of-ways. And here's a few more for you. The last major project we're going to talk about where we're going in the future is green ribbon funding. Now, what green ribbon is a certain percentage of all construction costs are set aside essentially for beautification into a fund somewhere. And this green ribbon fund is for non-attainment or near non-attainment TxDOT districts who qualify for air quality issues. This is really, well, this was originally an air quality agreement. It still is. So they did a lot of tree planting with it. But what happened is a lot of these green ribbon funds were going unused. Just in the past few years, and this green ribbon project is not, I should say, it's not maintenance division's project. But in the past few years, we've asked if there's any way we can take this unused funding and not only use it for these tree plantings that our landscaping groups take care of, but for wildflower seeding as well. So in our non-attainment or near non-attainment districts where they qualify for that funding, we've been working with our vegetation managers in those districts to purchase wildflower seeds and get those seeded via the Green Ribbon Project above and beyond the, hundreds of thousands of dollars we already spend, maybe even millions of dollars that we spend on seeding each year. But this is something we're still working on. It's still a very new sort of entry into this program for us. I want to say maybe 2020 was the first year that we were actually able to do that. So just very, very new getting up and started, especially when considering these funding sort of comes around once a year. We do seeding once a year. But yeah, we're definitely looking to continue to do more of that green ribbon funded seeding if possible. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about some of the current initiatives that we sort of have going. Just this last fall, we launched our hashtag Fall for Flowers initiative. And this is just sort of education about how important the fall time is for flowers, because of course, for most flowers, you're seeing them in the spring. We do have our great fall bloomers as well. But typically fall is very important for the flowers, but people don't see it. So the average person driving down the road doesn't see anything, no flowers maybe, and they don't think much of it. But this is a very important time to seed our wildflowers in the fall. So this whole program is just sort of going over why fall is important for wildflowers and how to properly manage, not necessarily just right-of-ways, but manage anything in the fall for that good pollinator propagation, getting those seeds to germinate and getting a nice strong stand of wildflowers. And of course, that doesn't always happen on the first year because we're very often at Mother Nature's mercy there. But that's just one thing we sort of educate about in that program. Also, we'll be starting up this spring our hashtag Wildflower Watch program, encouraging people on their social medias to use the hashtag Wildflower Watch to share their pictures of wildflowers, whether on the state right-of-ways or even off the state right-of-ways. Just what do you see blooming? Share your good images. That very, very important time of year when we see all the wildflowers, they get everyone's attention. We're looking for people to share those. So if you see or post any pictures of wildflowers in the spring, feel free to use that hashtag Wildflower Watch. And someone from TxDOT may see it. I know they'll be posting plenty on our own social medias. That's sort of out of my realm, but yeah, that's a big one that we're working on right now. That was more or less I had for the presentation. I just wanted to throw my contact info in there just in case. We'll definitely do some Q&A, and after that, I'm probably going to hop off because I'm already pushing a 14-hour workday today. Need some rest, but I'm happy to do as much Q&A as we need now. I just wanted to drop that contact information there for y'all. So did anyone have any questions? I haven't really been reading the chat. Let me see if I can pull that up.
Yeah, you've got several, Sam.
All righty, let me just expand this here. Let's look and see what we've got.
Starting about 6:58 p.m.
Yep, I see it. Okay, so is any planting being done in West Texas, Van Horn to El Paso? I can tell you for a fact, I shouldn't say for a fact, I'm almost certain that Texas Native Seeds program that we were talking about actually has a location out in Van Horn where they're working on some native seed varieties for out that way. And while it definitely is a little bit harder to get stuff to grow in the desert than it is over this way, we definitely do a lot of seeding there. Yes, we do have seeding specifications for out that way. They still have some of those wildflower species involved. Of course, it varies hugely regionally. I couldn't say exactly which ones we use off the top of my head, but yeah, we definitely do some seeding out in the desert areas, let's say. When TxDOT creates heavy density planting of trees on right-of-way is a primary goal to eliminate mowing areas. That's a good question, and that's one that I really just don't want to speak on because, again, that's something that would fall directly with our landscape division, or I'm sorry, they're not their own division. Our landscape section, which I believe is part of TxDOT's design division. I'm really not too knowledgeable on those tree plantings, and they don't have much to do with myself. I don't want to speak on their behalf. But I can tell you that a lot of those plantings do come from those green ribbon funds that I mentioned earlier. Native Plant Society sponsors 4 safety rest stops in Texas along the Monarch Highway. Yep, and those are the exact ones we talked about. That was a big membership with, or a big, not membership, what do you call it, but a big agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Native Plant Society. But yeah, the Native Plant Society goes and takes care of those Monarch way stations there. And that was a program that we're super happy to be involved with. When and why would we use herbicides? When, it just depends on the timing of what specific pest species we're trying to target. Why, it's pretty important when we only do 2 mowing cycles a year, because you have 2 mowing cycles a year, you can't effectively target those invasive species like Johnson grass that'll completely consume your right of way. There's a lot of other invasive or non-native, non-desirable species that we could talk about, and I won't go into a full list. But it's very, very important in that integrated vegetation management to have those different types of control to where we can target specific things. Because whereas we do our mowing, it's a little bit harder to target specific areas or plants. With our herbicides, we can definitely target those specific plants, much easier to get rid of those, without spraying our wildflowers. Next question was roughly the same. What is TxDOT's current policy regarding KR blue stem? Is it being eliminated or controlled? And if so, how? I know for a fact that we don't seed any KR blue stem or anything like that. It definitely is. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a quote unquote problem on our right of ways in the sense that it doesn't grow tall enough to create site issues. But of course that KR blue stem is non-native. Is it being eliminated or controlled? And if so, how? I'm not entirely sure on the elimination or control of that because that's sort of more of a regional thing, whereas we see that really strong in some areas and not others. And it would sort of be more at the local level where they would control that, but I'm just not too familiar off the top of my head with if we do anything specific for KR blue stem. What is TxDOT's current policy regarding Arundodonax giant cane? It is spreading out of control in a TxDOT right away. Yeah, it's always spreading out of control. That's another one of the really big threats that we see on top of that Johnson grass. So with that Arundo cane, we do have programs to eliminate that. Unfortunately, mowing in general is not very effective at eliminating that Arundo cane due to the fact that it spreads by seed and also by rhizome, all that good stuff. Well, maybe not good stuff. But yeah, we do have a herbicide program to target that stuff specifically using all aquatic approved herbicides, things that are safe to spray on it. At one point, we were actually part of a very interesting agreement. I don't know if any of y'all have ever heard of it, but we were working on some biological control methods. I believe it was with U.S. Fish and Wildlife with a certain species of borer wasp that actually bores into the Arundo. And it doesn't completely kill it, but it does weaken the plant significantly to the point where it can be controlled easier. That program was actually before my time, and there hasn't been anything really going on with that recently, but just sort of an interesting tidbit there. Do you work to eliminate non-native invasives like privet? Yeah, we absolutely do. Generally with privet, I don't know that we target that one specifically. I'm not actually too familiar with that. We're typically dealing with our non-native invasives that are our larger species that are a threat to public safety, things like that. Johnson grass is really the main offender there. But in general, yes, we do work to eliminate non-native invasives. Y'all have a lot of good questions. That's good. I've been to a few meetings where I don't get many, and that's always okay too, but these are definitely some good ones. All right, well, I mean, if y'all have any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat. If not, I may sign off, but again, I'll leave my contact information there. And of course, Debbie, you can feel free to share that with anyone who wants it in case you want to just send me an email. Always happy to talk about things, do other presentations, whatever you guys like. And again, thank you for the opportunity. I really love doing these talks, presentations, education, and hearing from you all.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Sam. We really appreciate you being here. That was a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll stop sharing my screen for now and log off. But just again, thank you all for for having me here today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
A while ago, I missed Ellen, and she needs to talk about our nice posters. So if you're not from our chapter and you want to log off